Today I'm going to talk about coding the infrastructure using Azure Resource Manager templates, but I will start with a bit of context. So back in the days, we all know that companies used to have their own in-house data centers, which was quite expensive and hard to maintain. And also when it comes to configuring deployment environments, it was very complicated and time-consuming because each environment had to be configured manually, and as the configuration for them evolved, each environment might end up being as unique as a snowflake in terms of the configurations. And so later on, the big cloud revolution happened, and it solved most of these problems by offering high available and scalable infrastructure at quite fair prices. But there was still one problem, that the configuration consistency problem still remained unsolved, because there was still someone who had to do all the configuration for each of the deployment environments. And this is where this is where infrastructure as code comes into play. What it represents, it is basically a process of creating and managing the infrastructure using definition files. And the benefits of this would be that you have consistency, because you basically create one definition file. You create it once, you define everything in there, all the resources or the infrastructure needed there, its configuration, and then you can deploy that same file many times on each environment and create different environments from that. And so you just work once, and then you get the benefit to benefit from it many times. And this increases the productivity and also lowers the costs of producing them and reduces the risks of errors. And one other benefit is that it can be, so since it's code, it can be versioned together with your application code. There are many options on the market, depending, so there are many platforms that help you to do this, depending on the cloud provider that you choose. But today we are going to stay in the Azure world, and just to create a bit of context, if there are people who are not familiar with this. Basically in Azure, at a very high level, we can say that everything is a resource. So a database is a resource, so virtual machine is a resource, so everything is a resource. And we can group those resources, well, we can group them based on what we want, but it is recommended to group them based on their application, their lifetime, and we can group them into resource groups. Also, everything that happens in Azure must be in the context of a subscription, and we can manage subscriptions using management groups. When we talk about Azure Resource Manager templates, what we're going to be discussing today only operates with these three layers, let's say like this. So we'll talk about resources, and we're going to deploy them in resource groups. They can also be deployed at subscription level, but we won't talk about that. We will focus on this. Okay, so I said that we have a lot of resources, that everything is a resource, and of course, where we have resources, we also need a manager, right? So Azure has its own manager, the so-called Azure Resource Manager, which is responsible for doing all the operations, creating, deleting, updating, and doing all the operations on the resources. So even when we go in the Azure portal, under the hood, we still use the Azure Resource Manager API. And it can also be used via the CLIs or even with REST clients directly. So what are ARM templates? They are basically the implementation of infrastructure as code in the Azure, for the Azure Resource Manager. It is basically a JSON file that defines the whole infrastructure and the configuration. It is has a big advantage that is a declarative syntax as opposed to old imperative scripts. and everything that we define there is then orchestrated by the resource manager, and it ensures that all the resources are created in the right order, and also tries to create them in parallel when possible to improve the efficiency. It is highly reliable because once a feature or a service becomes available in Azure, it will immediately be available to be used in the templates, and it can also be integrated in the CI or CD pipelines. Okay, so as I said, template file is just a JSON file that has a specific structure. The most important parts are here: the parameters, the variables, functions, resources, and outputs. The parameters are basically some inputs that allows us to customize some of the names maybe or configuration for our resources. The variables is just a section where we define values that we want to reuse. We can define also some custom functions, but they're quite dummy, just like this, so you can do much with them, but they're helpful sometimes. And the most important part, and the only one which is mandatory. So all the other sections are optional, but the resources part is mandatory. And this is where all the magic happens. This is where we'll define all the resources. And we can also have an output section where we return, maybe we created some names dynamically or something, and we just return them as outputs. It also comes with some small helpers, like some built-in functions that we can call inside an expression. An expression is basically a pair of square brackets. It has, so an example of a function is, and I think the most useful one is the concat one, which basically concatenates a lot or a few strings. There's a list, there are a lot of functions, and there's a list with all of them here. I've added the reference. Also, as I said, so the resource manager will try to deploy all the resources that we define in parallel. But for example, maybe sometimes we want to create some dependencies between them. Let's take, for example, a database that we want to create, but we want to make sure that before the database is created, we have a SQL server on which we create the database. And in order to create these dependencies, we have two options. One would be an explicit one, so we can put a depends on between two resources, and we explicitly say that they have a dependency. But we can also create implicit implicit dependencies by referencing the properties of one resource using the reference or the list keywords. There may be scenarios where we need to create multiple instances of the same resource, and we have some support for this also with the copy instruction. This is the syntax for copying resources. The copy can be applied also to variables or parameters and outputs, but it has a slightly different syntax. We can see that in the syntax for resources, we can see the number of instances that we want, and if we want to deploy them serial or in parallel. Sometimes, let's say when we have a simple environment with a few resources, we can put them in one file, and that's it. We define when we have everything there. But there might be scenarios when our environment is very complex and complicated and so on, and we might want to be able to decompose that somehow. And it also has some support for this. We can use either nested or linked templates. The nested templates, so what it basically means is that we put, for example, we extract some of, let's say, a database, the creation of a database, or the definition, sorry, of a database. We extract it in a separate template, and it's like a separate component with a single responsibility. And one way to use that will be then to use it as a nested template, which means that inside a template in the resource files, in the resource section, we define a special component, to say like this, and we put our nested template here. We see that it has a template property. But a much better solution from my point of view is to use the linked templates, which will actually decrease the size of the file that we define. So what this means is that we put all our small parts or components in separate files, and we just link the file inside the main template. The only thing to consider here is that the link to the file has to be a public URL, but we can make this very easily a secure one by using a storage account, or yeah, there are other options too. For the input of the parameters, because I said that we can have parameters in each file which represent the inputs, we can either have a parameters file that we can link again with a linked file, but we can also define them in line, as we will see a bit later on. Okay, so this being said, there are a lot of options, so it is very flexible and you can design it as it is best suitable for your project. So you can either deploy everything or define everything in one single file. You can have a separate template file for each resource, or you can use the nested and linked files, linked templates. So it's entirely up to what's best for you. About tools, we have some very good support from Visual Studio Code. It has an extension that has autocomplete, and it's very easy to edit the templates there. And there's also very nice graphical extension that will compile somehow what you define. It will show it in a nice UI, so that it will be easier to understand. And now let's see it in here. So I will start with the graphical UI that I mentioned earlier. So basically the end goal of this demo will be to create from one template. So I have a template here, and will be the end goal will be that from this one template to create two environments, a dev environment and a staging environment. Each of them will have a database server and a SQL server, and the database will have two app services. So an app service is basically a running environment for a web application. It will have two app services, and they will both be linked to one application inside, which is, let's say, a place where we can gather logs and debug information and some other things. And also our database server will have a firewall rule that will allow the web services to use the database, the web services from Azure. This is created automatically from the script that I have, from the definition that I have here. It doesn't work really perfect. So for example, I used the copy function for the sites, and it only sees one, it doesn't see two. And it doesn't pick up the implicit dependencies that are between the site and the application inside. But yeah, I think it's pretty good to give a rough idea of what you have in the template. Okay, and now let's look at the template. So first we have the parameter sections that I mentioned earlier. What's noticeable here is that parameters can have default values, and we can even restrict their input values to a specific set of values. I've added the description, so it is even recommended to have a description for each of them. Then we have the variable sections, where I basically defined the name for all my resources, and I did this using the concat function, which will concatenate the environment name that is received as a parameter, because if you remember, I said we're going to deploy them on 2 different environments. So we'll have a dev environment and the staging environment, and this will be reflected in the name of the resources. And we'll also have some, it concatenates them with some static text that I defined. I also defined a custom function. It is quite dummy, but I just put it to prove this. It only concatenates 2 inputs together, and then it comes the big fat resource section, where I first defined a SQL server, and it has as a child a database, and because the child parent structure doesn't implicitly create a reference, I have a dependency, sorry, I have to define an explicit dependency from the database to the server, so that it will create it before the database. It will be created before the database. Also, I added the firewall setting for the firewall rule exception that will allow the web applications to access the database. This is the hosting plan, which is not important. And then I have the deployment or the definition of the web services or the app services, and I used the copy function to create 2 instances, and we can see that the template or the definition of them comes from a linked template, which I have added into a storage account. I will show you a bit later on how I added that here. And then I have the parameters which are given to the parameters for this linked template, which I put here in line. We can also see that the connection string that is given as a parameter here is created using a reference, which will create an implicit dependency to the database. Maybe let's have a look at the template. So this is the linked template that I put there for the app service. This is my local version of it. And what is important to notice here is that I have a reference to, I have a reference to the application insights, which will gather the blogs for both of the app services. And if we come back to, one more thing, in here I also have the connection string defined with the input parameter that was set here. And if we look at this main template, we can see that the application insights is actually defined after the web app or the app service. And the resource manager will pick up the dependencies and deploy them in the correct order. And I also have an output section which will return the name that were created dynamically, the name of the app services, so that I will know where to deploy the applications in the pipeline. And now I will go back here. As I said, everything that we will do today will be in the context of a resource group. So I have 2 resource groups, one for the dev environment and one for the staging environment. We can see that they are empty. I will refresh so that you can believe me. Okay, so they are empty. So we'll start from scratch. We have nothing, just 2 empty resource groups that have no value. And I also have a pipeline. I will start the deployment and we'll come back to it later because the deployment takes a few minutes and I will explain it later, but I just want to start it now. Okay, so it will do, it is created to do the deployment on staging after the one on dev is successful. We can look at it here. Okay, good. So let's go back to the presentation. One other nice feature is that we can create that, because you saw that the template might look a bit ugly, and it can be also, so we can also generate a template from some existing resources. The only disadvantage of this would be that it will generate a lot. It is very verbose and it will generate all the properties of the resources and we might not need them. And it is also not very reusable because it has no parameters, or everything is hard-coded and you have to do a bit of work to make it maintainable. But I would say it's a good starting point, and it's also a very good thing if you already have some infrastructure and you want created manually and you want to migrate to using ARM templates, because you can extract the settings that were made in, because it would be very hard to pick them just by identifying them in the UI. So it will be very easy to see what specific configuration was made to them. As I mentioned at the beginning, this Azure Resource Manager exposes an API, and what happens basically when we define the resources in the template file, each definition of a resource is then transformed into an API call, which has the content of what we defined and some specific values based on where we run the templates. Some best practices around defining them would be to limit the size of the files by using linked templates, to put comments or description for each of the resource, even for the parameters. There are also two nice tools that I think I'll be able to show them. So there's a testing tool, which is, let's say, some sort of static analysis of the best practices. So it will just do a static analysis of your code and highlight some things that are not okay. It has some initial test cases defined, but you can add more or remove or edit them as you want. And there's also a what if operator, which is like a sneak peek in the future that will basically take the resource group that you have, if you deploy to a resource group, and the template, and make a diff between the two of them, and will show you what will happen if you deploy this to that resource group. And maybe we can have a look at these two things. So this is, I'm not sure if you can see it. So this is that testing tool that I mentioned. So you can see that there are a lot of past tests, but there's also one that failed, which, for example, says that I have a hard-coded URL in my template. And if we look a bit in the future, so as you saw, my resource groups were empty before creating the resources, and I ran this before. And you can see here in green, it shows with the plus and the green color all the resources that will be created. So, for example, if one of them would have been edited or deleted, there will be highlighted with a different symbol and different color. Good. And there's also from one of the good practices would be to start with an existing template. So there are a few repositories on GitHub with quick start templates, and you can find all different combinations of configurations, like database and web app, or all different types of configurations. Around the parameters, it will be good to, as you saw in my template, to specify the environment as a parameter, because we might want to use it in the names of the values of the resources. To provide a description for each of the parameters, use default values when possible. Also, the location must come from a parameter, and to be set to the resource group location as a default value. And if we use usernames and passwords, at least for the secrets, it would be useful to mark them as secure, or to define them as a secure string type. Using this, basically your secrets won't be displayed in logs or any UIs or consoles or anything. Okay, so we defined this big template. Now we have to see what we can do with it. And how can we deploy it? It can be deployed directly from the Azure portal. It can be deployed from the Azure CLI or the PowerShell, even with a REST API call. There are also some embedded GitHub actions, and as we are going to see in the demo, it can also be embedded in the pipelines, in the DevOps pipeline. When we deploy it, we can choose two different modes. There's the incremental mode, which is the default one, and it can basically be translated into add or update. So it will basically just add new resources and will update the existing one. So if you change the configuration, but if, for example, in your template, there is a resource missing and the resource exists in your resource group, but not in your template, then it won't delete it. The other mode, the complete mode, is can be translated to add and update and delete. So the difference between the previous one would be that if you have a resource that it's in your resource group, but you delete it from the template, it will also be deleted from the resource group. So this one basically transforms what is in the template at the moment, what is specified, will translate exactly the same thing in the resource group. And it's recommended to, when you use this mode, to use that what if operator so that you can see before what changes will happen. So you'll notice if you're going to delete something by accident or so. Okay, and we said that the template file has some parameters that can be set from outside. We can define them in line, as you saw in my template. Also, if you, for example, deploy them from the CLI, you can define them in the CLI, or the CLI will ask for them as input parameters. But the most reliable and maintainable way would be to use a parameters file, which has a very simple syntax. It just has a parameter section where you define the parameter name and its value, and comes with the benefit of being able to reference a key vault, which is a secure way to store secrets in Azure. And you can use that to retrieve your secrets or to keep your secrets values so that you won't keep them here in plain text. Okay, and now let's have some fun. Let's see if our deployment worked. Okay, so we can see that the dev environment was created. The staging is still in progress, but first maybe we can have a look at how this all happened. So I have build pipelines. It's very simple. I have a simple build pipeline that so my application is, as I mentioned before, just two very dummy APIs, and in the build pipeline I just build the applications and publish the artifacts. And one important thing is that because I keep my templates together in the source control together with the application, in this same step I will deploy or publish my templates to a storage account so that I can have them available with secure links. Next thing is the pipelines, the release pipelines, where I use the artifacts produced by the build pipeline as inputs for a deployment to a dev environment. And then when this one is successful, a deployment to a staging environment will happen automatically. And if we look, one sec. If we look at what happens here, we have a few simple steps. So the first one that does all the magic is the deployment of the ARM template. I specify the resource group where I want to deploy, and I give the link to the storage account where I saved my template file and also the parameters file. And one important thing to mention is that I can override the parameters in here. I can also put them in the file, but I just wanted to be easy to show that I can set a dev value for the environment name for the dev deployment. And for the staging deployment, I override the environment variable with the staging value, but it's in the other definition. Then I have another step that gathers the outputs that the ARM template produced, and it makes them available in here in this pipeline. And then I have just two web APIs deployments where I use the output values that were generated from the template. So if we go back to the template, we can see that I have two dummy APIs. One is called Sessions Web App and the other is called Speakers Web App. And I use the names of the resources that were provided as outputs. I use them here so that I will know where to deploy my application. Good, and now let's see the deployment. So this is the dev resource group that you remember. This is how it looked before. It was empty at the beginning. Now I will refresh and see what it did. Okay, so we can see here that we have two web applications. So they're app services or web apps, kind of the same thing. They have the name dev, and they also have an index because I think I didn't show this in the name. One second here. Where I provide the parameters, I also use a copy index, which represents the index of the copy iteration. And it starts with 0, but I gave it an offset of 1, and that's why we see 1 and 2 and not 0 and 1. So I have two web applications. I have the service plan. No, sorry, this is the application insights. And if we open one of the applications and we go to application insights, we can see that it was linked to our application insights resource. Okay, then I have the service plan, which is not important, and I have a SQL server and a database. And now let's see if the application works. I can open both of them so that we can see that. Sorry. Okay, so the first one, when the application runs, it will take a bit more to initialize. Okay, so as I said, they are just very dummy APIs, but I want to prove that it connects to the database, so I will just do a few posts. And it will hopefully work. Yay. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, and now if I want to get them all, you can see that they were stored in the database. Now I can retrieve them, so everything works fine. Now if we go to see what our list is doing. Oh, okay, so it finished also the staging one. If we look, sorry. I just wanted to show the steps of the staging. So it has the exact same steps, but here when we override the environment parameter, we use a staging. And if we go at the staging resource group and refresh, it has the same infrastructure, so everything is exactly the same with the same settings. It just has some different names as we configured. And again, if I will open this, we can see that it is linked to the application insights from the staging environment. It has again the database and everything else. And let's see if these ones work. Again, it takes a bit more to load than the first time. Come on. Okay. So they're exactly the same APIs that I deployed previously on the dev environment. And okay, we can see that it works. And if we get this one works too. So everything was saved. We'll try this one also, but I think you got the idea that based on our configuration, it allowed database. So if you will try to create a database and just create a database in the web app and put the connection string of the database in the web app, you'll see that you cannot connect by default. You need to make that setting that allows web apps to connect to the database. So we made that using the script, and we can see that it works without any other manual intervention. Okay, and I have one final slide, which is for questions. And this was pretty much it.
Thank you very much. Great.
Yeah.
Very much. And you surprised us with the last slide. And this is all questions. You should imagine that behind the scenes, the next whoa, this is the final slide. Okay, excellent. So, any recent experiences in concrete projects?
Yeah, we had a few in the company, and I also done one or two, I think. But from my personal experience, I have never done something very complex. So just a few APIs and databases and so on. I haven't done like big infrastructure with networks and so. But yeah, we use them in real projects.
Mm-hmm. I was asking more from a client perspective. How do they perceive, this?
Well, we usually from our company, it depends when we are allowed to do everything. We try to follow our best practices, and this is one of the things that we consider a best practice, and we try to add it in all the projects that we can. Sometimes we try to explain also to the clients what are the benefits and use this in the projects, but yeah, there might be situations where it does not apply, or it is very hard to migrate to this because of what they already have, or yeah, there might be clients that don't want to invest in this. But until now, we only had, I think, positive feedback and response from the client side.
All right. And then we've got a very particular question from a friend of ours, I presume. It's Julian. What is the versioning solution for JSON templates? So you've used 1.0.0.0.
Yeah, so it's something that I don't know by heart, but you can find in the documentation. There are references about all the versions. So basically, they are released quite often. There are different versions for each of the resources. There are different versions, and yeah, it's something that you can check in the documentation.
Okay. I'll instruct Julian to check the documentation. I think we both know this guy personally, Timișoara, right? Okay, and I think we have one more question before we break. is there a one-to-one relationship between deploying with ARM templates and deploying with Azure CLI? If you've came across.
Not sure exactly what you mean by one-to-one relationship, but you can use either of them. So this template can be deployed also from the pipeline, from the pipeline, as you can saw, but it can be also deployed from the Azure CLI. But I'm not sure I really understood the question. So you can do the same thing and have the same results, except deploying the application. But you can create the resources just by running a command. I think I have that in here. One sec. Oh no, it was at the end. Is it? Okay, so we can deploy, so we have the same template file. We deployed it in using the pipelines, using that step, Azure ARM deploy one step. But you can also deploy it from local, let's say, that's how I did it initially. You can use this and give it the path of your template file and deploy it, or you can use the PowerShell with different commands, like a different command, and again deploy it from here. But I'm not sure if this answers the question.
Yeah, no worries, because we'll ask Victor, he owns these questions, to contact you directly.
Yeah, so of course, if
more
you
details.
Have any other questions or so, you can ask me, and if I know, I can help.
All right. So Adina, thank you very, very much. You did great.
Thank you.
Nice presentation.
Thanks a lot.